Hi there, Dave Pitek from Room Sound here. In this tutorial, we're going to discuss using time stretch-based drum editing techniques to tighten up a drum performance by conforming it to a grid. In a future video, we'll demonstrate slice-based drum editing tools such as Beat Detective. Before we get started, I'd like to point out that for these tutorials, we're going to be using Pro Tools, but the techniques we're demonstrating are largely platform independent. Most modern DAWs have some sort of variation on the features utilized in this tutorial, so consult your software's documentation for specific implementation instructions. Let's get to it. When we talk about drum editing, or drum tightening, what we're really talking about is the relationship between the grid and the hits played by the drummer. So what is the grid? Well, the grid is simply a visual representation of the time signature, its subdivisions, and the tempo of the song. Most often, this information is entered into the computer long before drum tracking begins. This information forms what's called a tempo map. The click track can then be set up, synchronized to the tempo map, and then the drummer will play back to the click track. This is the easiest and most commonly used method for tracking drums. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're tracking drums using this method. You'll see here that we've already set up the tempo map in this session and set the session to bars and beats. Here we have the tempo, 128 beats per minute, and we've set the meter to 4/4 time. You can see when I select bar number 1 that the measure is divided into 4 parts. Those 4 subdivisions mean the grid resolution is set to quarter notes. If we want to increase the grid resolution, we simply select a new value in the grid menu. Notice how when I select an 1/8 note grid in the grid selection menu, the grid displayed in the timeline changes. Let's go ahead and change that back to quarter note resolution for now. In this session, you can see that we've set up several drum tracks along with a click track and a pair of scratch guitar tracks so that the drummer can more easily follow the song while recording. Let's have a listen to what the drummer is going to hear in his headphones while recording. Okay, it looks like the click track is properly synced to the music. The only problem is that the click track is set to quarter notes. In this case, that means that the only time the drummer will be able to hear the click track over the sound of his drumming is when he's off time. This is obviously not an optimal setup. To correct this problem, we'll go to the meter settings. You'll notice a marker which indicates that we've set the meter to 4/4 time. Double-click on the meter marker to open up the meter change dialog box. Now, we're not going to change the meter, but we are going to change the click resolution. As you can see, it's set to quarter notes, and we want to change it to 1/8 notes. Let's go ahead and make that change, and then hit OK. Much better. Now we're ready to track some drums. Let's record and enable the drum tracks and get started. That performance was pretty good, but there's definitely some parts that need a little tightening to make them sound their best. Let's start preparing our tracks for Elastic Audio processing. The first step in this process is to group your drums together into a Pro Tools edit group. The reason that we do this is to maintain the phase relationships between our drum microphones when moving the audio around. This step is vitally important if you want your drums to sound good. To create this group, we will first select all the tracks we want to include in our edit group. In this case, our drum tracks. Once these tracks are selected, hit Command-G to bring up the Create Group dialog box. If you're on a Windows computer, the key command to bring up this window is Control-G. In the Group dialog box, we'll first name our group. We'll call this group Drums. We're going to create an edit group by clicking on the Edit radio button. We'll make sure that all the tracks we want in our group are selected on the right and disable mutes and solos linked within groups. Now click OK. The group we've created now shows up in the Group section of the Edit window in the bottom left corner of the screen. You'll notice that when the group is active, any selections we make, regardless of what track we make the selections in, selects the entire group, so any edits that we make will also be applied to the entire group. If you turn this off, it goes back to normal and we can make selections in individual tracks. But for now, we want to leave the group selected. With the drum group selected, navigate to the Elastic Audio selector in one of the tracks in the drum group. When you click on it, it will give you 5 processing algorithms for Elastic Audio: polyphonic, rhythmic, monophonic, Varispeed, and X-Form. According to Avid's documentation, the optimal mode for processing drums is rhythmic. However, I've found that there are fewer artifacts, particularly in the cymbals, in polyphonic mode. You can change back and forth between these settings at any time, so feel free to experiment and see what algorithm you prefer. After you select your preferred algorithm, the tracks will temporarily gray out as Pro Tools analyzes them. During this process, the software looks at each track's waveform and figures out where all the drum hits have occurred. Now we'll look at how to move the audio to conform to the grid we've set up. By default, the Track View selector is set to Waveform on our drum tracks. We're going to change it to Warp. In Warp View, we can see that Pro Tools has put a marker at every drum transient. When we look closely, we can see that while many of the drum transients line up to the grid, some fall outside the grid lines. To fix this, we'll simply adjust our grid resolution to 1/8 notes, just like we did at the start of this tutorial. This song is relatively simple, with pretty much all of the drum hits coming in on 1/8 note subdivisions. Because of this, we can demonstrate a powerful feature of Elastic Audio. Once the tracks have been analyzed and the tempo map has been set up, we can easily conform or quantize the audio to the grid. From the Event menu, navigate to the Event Operations submenu, and finally select the Quantize option. You may be used to seeing this dialog box when working with MIDI, but when using Elastic Audio, we can use the same functionality on audio as we do on MIDI tracks. In the Quantize dialog box, make sure Elastic Audio events are selected. Since pretty much all of the drum hits fall directly on 1/8 note subdivisions, we set the Quantize grid to 1/8 notes. This means that the highest resolution that Elastic Audio will look for is 1/8 notes. Be sure that you have your entire drum performance selected, and then hit Apply. When we zoom in, we can see that Pro Tools has conformed the drum transients to the grid. It's that easy. Now this song's drums are fairly simple and the performance was tight to begin with. If the drums were more complicated with lots of fast 16th note fills or the drummer was sloppy, some manual editing may be necessary. Let's take a look at how that would be accomplished. As we look closely at the unconformed drum tracks, we can see that Pro Tools has added a marker at every point where a drum hit occurred. When we place our mouse over one of these markers and hold the Control key, the cursor changes to a plus sign. At this point, clicking the mouse will promote the warp marker. For faster or more complicated editing jobs, manual promotion of warp markers is sometimes the only reliable method of editing. Let's promote some warp markers. I actually prefer to do all my warp marker promotion manually, even for relatively simple songs such as this one. Here's why. A common criticism of grid-edited drums is that they are too perfect, too robotic sounding, and lack a human element or groove. With time stretch editing and manual warp marker promotion, we can have the best of both worlds. Drums that sound very tight, but also retain the groove and feel of the original performance. Let me demonstrate. Take a look at this hit. It's a strike on the hi-hat. If I promote the snare and the kick markers, watch what happens when I move them. The position of the hi-hats scales proportionally to the amount that I move the surrounding hits. If I promote the shells, meaning the snare hits, kick hits, and toms, but leave the cymbal markers unpromoted, the drums themselves will conform to the grid, while leaving the cymbals to fall where they may. This proportional scaling will only occur in the area between two promoted warp markers, so in most cases it's a good practice to place a warp marker on the first and last hit of the song before manually promoting other warp markers. You can experiment with promoting different drums or combinations of drums to get your desired level of groove while still maintaining conformity to the grid. On particularly vibey tracks, sometimes I'll only conform the snare drum hits on the second and fourth quarter note subdivisions and just leave everything else alone. It's up to you. The more you experiment with this tool, the more you'll realize just how powerful and versatile it is. Well, that's it for part 1 of our tutorial on drum tightening. Stay tuned for part 2, which will cover slice-based editing and conforming the tempo map to a pre-recorded drum performance. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website at www.roomsound.com for more tutorials, tips, and tricks aimed at getting you the best drum sounds possible. Keep checking back because we're adding new content all the time. And if you have an idea for a tutorial that you'd like to see, drop us a line on our contact page and we'll see what we can do. Thanks for watching.